Welcome to another rendition of Score Talk, where we discuss gems in the world of film music. I'm Zev Burrows, coming to you from New York City.
And I'm Miriam Sternlicht, coming to you from London, UK.
And it's been a little while since we've done one of these, so I think the Oscars are well and past. Congratulations to Ludwig and
Yes,
and the entire Black Panther team,
fantastic
and
achievement.
to exactly and to Lady Gaga and her fellow co-writers for A Star Is Born.
Yes, it was quite a fun evening. I actually stayed up to watch the ceremony. I don't usually do that, but I don't know. I was
Mm.
suddenly, I think, ever since I got involved with the industry, it's become a bit more exciting. So I did something so silly. I got myself. They weren't airing it here, and I got any of the. I couldn't find it anywhere online. So I signed myself up for a 2 week Sky Cinema pass because they
Hmm.
were airing it exclusively, and I watched it through the night. I think I went to bed at like 3 or 4 a.m. It was ridiculous, but it was worth it.
It was definitely worth it, and it's probably the best ceremony I've ever watched. It just zipped right by,
Yeah,
and I think the lack of host. I think other award ceremonies in the future should learn from this and learn that you don't really need a host. And it just it's some because a lot of the times it's just painfully unfunny jokes and it's just dragging out. And award ceremonies are long enough anyways, so there's almost no need. So. But that's just the humble opinion of one irate New Yorker. So
I rate.
so, but it's been a little while since we've done one of these. So how are you, Miriam?
I'm good. I'm good. I'm a little tired because I went to bed last night at a semi-reasonable hour for a weekend.
Hmm.
By semi-reasonable, I mean 1:30ish a.m. But I couldn't sleep, and I
Hmm.
suddenly had a hankering, God knows why, to watch Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part Two.
Hmm.
So I stuck it on, and I mean that movie is just the music. Alexandre Desplat's music for that film gets me every time. I was sobbing like a baby, and closed my laptop at 4 a.m. So, well, that's life. But I thoroughly enjoyed it, so it was worth it. Tell me, how are you, Zeb? How's your love life? Let's hear.
What love life? I mean, probably prehistoric primates have better luck than I do. So they have more active luck.
Prehistoric primates like King Kong?
Uh, yeah, I think that's an appropriate fit. I think King Kong has a little more luck than I do in the love department. So and he certainly we certainly see it in Peter Jackson's 2005 epic King Kong, a remake
Mm.
of a remake of the original 1933 masterpiece by Marion C. Cooper and Ernest Schoedsack, and scored by the wonderful Max Steiner, who was often referred to as almost one of the godfathers of film music.
Yes.
Was I think he was head of Warner Brothers music department for many, many years, scored 200 pictures, won 3 Academy Awards, and sort of with King Kong, sort of started what we often consider to be the leitmotif style,
Yes.
and which has been done through the Hollywood ages ever since. As far as I know, this 1933 version is Peter Jackson's favorite movie. Actually, I
It
read that
is the
somewhere.
movie that inspired him to become a director, yes.
So, and it's a masterpiece. It gets right to the point. It's an hour and a half. It doesn't rely on an hour and a half of meandering backstory,
I
which
have
is
to say, speaking of the length, I mean, this remake, this 2005 remake, it was way too long. I
a
mean,
King a King Kong movie should never be 3 hours.
I was drifting in and out of consciousness throughout that entire movie. It was too much.
Uh-huh.
I was more enthralled by the score than the movie, certainly,
Hmm.
without a shadow of doubt. I think what James Newton Howard achieved in 5 weeks is pretty spectacular.
In five
Um,
weeks, yeah.
in 5 weeks. I mean, I don't think it's his finest, But I do like that he kind of mixed his natural style, which is very elegant and modern, with more of a from time to time a golden age sound. I found certain cues reminding me actually of Bernard Herrmann. Some like I think the third cue. I'm going to just get the name up because yeah, defeat is always momentary. That one reminded me very much of like the Bernard Herrmann sound.
Which Herrmann score?
Just his general sound. Bernard Herrmann's scores are all mishing together in my head because I've studied him so much recently and listened to his work. Just his general intense orchestral sound. I did enjoy the score. I think A Fateful Meeting was beautiful, very typical Newton Howard with his melancholy romantic sound. There were some beautiful highlights in the score. It was too long, the movie, though.
Right. I think because I'm no expert on James Newton Howard. I still have yet to seek out a lot of his many works. I mean, I've seen several, but I wouldn't call myself a James Newton Howard fanboy in the sense that I am definitely a Bernard Herrmann fanboy. But I adore Bernard Herrmann like nobody else. But
we know, Zev. We know. You've mentioned it several times.
And it often needs repeating. But I certainly think what he had to do in 5 weeks, and especially I was reading too that he was composing the score whilst recording sessions were happening. So
yes. Yeah.
This is a case where almost any other composer, most people would probably go nuts having to do this, and I probably I'm surprised he didn't go nuts, but it just speaks to how versatile and how professional James Newton Howard is. So
they were working 18-hour days. They had orchestrators and copyists working overnight. It was chaotic.
It was very chaotic, and the fact that they got it done in time is a miracle. And the 5 weeks, considering that I don't. How much time was Howard Shore given to compose the score originally? Because obviously the theme of the poll this week is our second or third themed poll. The first two being related to the Oscars. This one being related to scores that were replaced in lieu of rejected scores. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering how much time Howard Shore had to do his score.
Well, I tell you what I do know. I know that apparently he had recorded 3/4 of it. I don't know how much time he was originally given, but we have a little surprise for our listeners, and we have Gergely Hubai, who was the author of the book Torn Music, which focuses on rejected film scores. It's a history about rejected film scores. He's going to join us in a few minutes to fill us in, to give us some information about rejected scores, hopefully, focusing on today's pick, which is James Newton Howard's score for King Kong, and which was in favor of Howard Shore's. And actually, I'm going to invite him to join us now.
Excellent.
Hello, welcome, Gergely. We're delighted to have you.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Hi.
So we've been talking about rejected scores, and we're just going to tell our listeners again that we're delighted to have you as our guest, Gergely Hubai, who is the author of the wonderful book Torn Music, Rejected Film Scores, A Selected History.
I can hear you picking it up just from the sound of it.
Yes, it's open next to me. So Gergely, what can you tell us thoughts. What can you offer us on this particular score of James Newton Howard for King Kong? And just generally, what can you tell us about the concept of rejected scores?
Well, rejected scores happen more than you would think, but I must say it's been happening less and less frequently when compared with the, let's say, even the past 10 years. And there are, of course, some reasons for that, which is most of the rejected scores come from a failure of communication, that the composer cannot really show what he has in mind for the director. And in the end, when when all cards are down, they basically realize that this is not what I was looking for, and or a producer doesn't like it. Somebody who is a decision maker has a conflict. There are a few rare exceptions when other factors can in, like family reasons or legal reasons, but mostly it's a failure in communication. Now, the reason this has been getting less and less frequent is something I'm sure the listeners are all familiar with, the fact that now you have to mock up basically everything. So you can decide earlier that something is not working, and you don't have to wait until the recording stage when you realize that this is not what I had in mind. So even though it gives composers a lot more to work with, a lot more extra tasks, so to speak, it also makes the rejection much easier at a much earlier stage if something doesn't quite work out as they intended to. And this is something that they really didn't have when King Kong was happening. The mock-up technology was still pretty in the early stages, and surprises can happen.
Right.
I have a quick question. You said that they're happening less and less in the most recent 10 years. On average, what would you say the average number of scores are being thrown out in the last 5 years or so? Is it relatively smaller than we would think now?
This is a very hard question because we have to decide what is a rejected score. Basically, you have to make a distinction between whether the score was recorded or not. And the other thing is that nowadays we have much better information about who's scoring what. Basically, we have these industry papers where they announce every week when somebody signs up for something. So if the name changes, something has happened. Maybe a scheduling conflict or maybe something else. Number-wise, I'm not sure it's less, but working hours-wise, it's less because nowadays they can part ways during the mock-up stage. So not after spending 3 months on the film and on the recording stage, but basically after 2 or 3 weeks, if you don't see eye to eye with the composer, you can part ways much easier. So I'd say number-wise, it's very hard to say because we don't know what to say is a rejected score, but fully recorded symphonic rejected scores are definitely less and less in numbers. When my book came out, I finished writing it in 2008. It came out a few years later, but that was really a high point when every year you had something big, like you had Troy, you had King Kong, you had for a period The Wolfman by Danny Elfman. So you had all these things coming together, and just it seemed that this is something that's going to keep happening. And nowadays, if you think about it, there are not many of them. You cannot think of any big rejections from the last few years, I think. Like something that really shook the industry.
Right.
Can you shed any light on this particular score for King Kong?
Well, I think I mentioned this to you guys in an earlier discussion that one of the problems with this score is that it's commercially not available. So, you can't show anything to the viewers. And the sad thing is that some stories are more interesting and more fun than others. And this is one particularly bleak and mostly political story that's not really related to the quality of the music, not related to any sort of interesting artistic difference. There's a big pile of ugly political side to it, which is not something the listeners would be interested in, I think.
Sure.
One thing I can tell you which is related to this idea is that Howard Shore's score was to be recorded in New Zealand and the final score was recorded in Los Angeles. So take what you get with it.
Oh, I see. Interesting.
So expanding on that, I was just wondering if was Shore's score considered too old-fashioned? Like I know that was the case with Gabrielle Yared for Troy, that they tested it with screening audience and they considered it, too old-fashioned. It was too brassy. It was too bold, and they chucked it and got it replaced with James Horner. Was that the case with Shore's original? Did he want to be a little more in the fashion of Max Steiner?
Now, one of the reasons, maybe you've read this somewhere, you think about it, because one part of Shore's job was adapting Steiner's score for the Kong reveal sequence. If you watch that sequence in the film, you realize that it's the Steiner score adapted for like a theater orchestra.
Yes.
And
Right.
if you look closely at the film, you realize it's Howard Shore standing there at the conducting
Right.
podium.
Yep.
So that, but otherwise, I'm sure he wasn't going to adopt the Steiner score for the new picture, because it's actually, you can see how corny it sounds in that little theater sequence, deliberately corny. So that couldn't be applied to the film. Now, as far as I know and as far as I can tell, this score was partially recorded, partially demoed, and partially written, so there is no complete recording. They pulled the plug earlier than the completion of the score, which happens from time to time, that the plug is pulled mid-recording. But I'd say there was at least a good, let's say, between half hour, 45 minutes recorded, as far as my understanding of the situation goes. And the rejection was announced at about mid-October, and then the film came out in mid-December. So I think there was only 7 weeks left for writing and recording the new score.
Wow.
Even then, that's ridiculously crazy.
There are these production diaries of the King Kong, which are on the DVD, Blu-ray, and they were released on separate DVD when the movie came out. Now, the funny thing is, if you look at that, you will notice that how James Newton Howard was working with his team. And it's really, if you just look at the number of orchestrators and contractors and copies, it's just crazy. So it was like really a big teamwork on everybody's part on LA. Now, one thing you will not see in the DVD and the Blu-ray is that they removed one of the production diaries, because that was about Howard Shore. And when these production diaries were put on the website about King Kong, it was just like the other ones. And then when the production diaries were released on the DVD, the studio asked them to remove the videos themselves. But the Howard Shore video was not preserved and not put on the Blu-ray collections.
Mm-hmm.
So in that one, you actually had a little bit of Howard Shore conducting. You could see him literally conducting, and not in the theater, in the film, but the actual recording session. And you could hear maybe about 5 seconds of score in it.
Wow.
Interesting. And I was also reading Newton Howard also had to bring on additional writers. I saw Blake Neely, additional composer, Chris
I
Bacon.
think there's nothing surprising about that. That's how it works, even on a regular picture, not to mention something like King Kong. So.
Stick with King Kong necessarily. I mean, we did say that we're going to discuss it because we are.
With rejected scores, as I said, this is one of the worst films you could pick because you cannot show anything to the audience.
Right.
And in that way, it's not as interesting as anything like even the Torn Curtain, 2001: A Space Odyssey, The Exorcist, or.
By all means, tell us. Pick one that you think is a wow story, and we would love to hear.
Do you prefer something more modern or something from the classics, maybe?
It could be either one. I mean, I think Torn Curtain's one of the most volatile cases, and it happened between one of the most iconic partnerships in cinema history, and my personal favorite as well. And we talked about North by Northwest in our first podcast, so I would love to talk about Torn Curtain for a minute.
Yes.
Okay, well, I can tell you that at the end of the 60s, there was a wave of 3 rejected scores that really shook up this whole thing. Because rejected scores, as you can see from my book, was nothing new. But Torn Curtain was the example which showed that it can happen to anyone, like the closest director-composer duo could suffer from it. And then 2 years later, 2001: Space Odyssey was the one that shook the industry. It was actually not that well known at the time that the film had any other score. And actually it had a score before Alex North's score too. But it was the one that shook the industry people and made basically Stanley Kubrick somebody not to work with from Hollywood, from the Hollywood composer establishment. And then the final one, which actually is most people forget about nowadays, is Battle of Britain, where Sir William Walton's score was thrown out for flimsy reason. And that one is actually very funny because not funny in the ha-ha sense, but funny in the sense that it made national headlines. It appeared in regular newspapers because it was a matter of like national pride or confusion that the great Sir William Walton, who did write film scores before, was thrown out of this prestige project. And that was one that the audience took most note of. It wasn't Torn Curtain, it wasn't Space Odyssey, it was Battle of Britain that really shook them. And from that moment onwards, almost every year you can find in my book one more or less better known picture for every single year that this happened to.
Right. Do you know how much time Ron Goodwin was given to replace Walton's score? Because I know on situations like Chinatown, Jerry Goldsmith only had, like 10 or 12 days to compose and record a new score after Philip Lambrose was tossed out.
Mm-hmm. Well, in this case, it wasn't that dramatic. So I think in the case of Battle of Britain, it was something like he had at least 1 month or even more. It wasn't as much of a rush job, but it's a much longer score. The official criticism against that score was that it was simply not long enough. So one of the things that Goodwin had to do was actually make sure he wrote more music than Walton, because the official reasoning from United Artists' part was that there's not enough music to fill an LP. Which is of course not true, but it sounded good on paper. But of course Goodwin had to write about twice as much music.
Interesting. I'm trying to think about that in relation to today, and actually that does make a lot of sense, because I can easily see how a lot of directors, I'm just wondering if the directors of Battle of Britain were afraid of silence in the way that I think a lot of directors these days are afraid of silence.
Well, in that case, I would say you once again project something that's happening today to the past, and it's not necessarily true. Because in that particular case, the director had nothing to do with it. Even the producer it was the studio, it was the so-called the brass, the executives who, and in fact, in Battle of Britain case, it seems like it was sort of decision by United Artists soundtrack label and not the actual studio, as they had some input. Officially. But of course it was also heavily a politically motivated thing, and actually it was related to as the final distinction between the British and the American payment system of the composers. So it was also heavily political, but at least they made up a good sounding reason for it. And actually I have the film with both versions of the score. The Walton score is sparse, and I would say it's interestingly spotted. It's not spotted like the Goodwin version. So the music is basically at different parts in the film sometimes, And it's an interesting choice because, of course, one of the problems with Battle of Britain is that a lot of it takes place on planes with lots of sound effects, engines, bombs are dropping, machine gun fire. So scoring that is very hard. Walton actually focused on some of the quieter stuff, while Goodwin did the quieter stuff, but also he did score some of the battles, but not all of them. And in fact, one of Walton's cues is actually retained in the film after Laurence Olivier said that, he would remove his name from the credits or something if they didn't respect Walton at least that much. The battle in the air cue is actually from Walton's score. And Goodwin didn't write music for that. So we can see it was a prearranged decision that Goodwin didn't have to write music for that because they would keep the Walton cue. But otherwise, the music went.
Interesting. Wow.
And if you want to tie to King Kong also has airplanes in it, so.
There you go. Some of the most iconic airplanes out there.
Yeah, it's flawless connection.
I had a hard time getting through that movie, I've got to admit.
Yeah.
Well, it's not for which one, King Kong or Battle of Britain?
King Kong.
Well, actually, there is an extended version for you to enjoy with 20 minutes of previously unseen footage.
Because why wouldn't Peter Jackson do that?
Of course.
Yeah, he's not known to extend his movies after the theatrical release. As I was revisiting King Kong for you guys, I actually focused a bit on the I have the extended version too, and I always wondered, what do you do with the extended version when you put back scenes in? But the composer obviously wrote music for the shorter cut of the film. So what do you do with the new sequences? Because you don't have him come back and write music for those 10 or 20 minutes of previously not existing sequence. And can you guess what happens?
No, do tell.
Well, of course, they do tracking and they put music from all other parts of the film into those scenes. And the funny thing is, I was looking what they were doing is that when it's a short edit, like a little insert, such as they have this sequence where Kong is basically captured. And in the theatrical version, he's captured. He doesn't put up a fight really. And in the extended version, for about an additional 10 seconds, he destroys like a wooden house. But that's new footage. And there they just, pick a piece of action music and just splice it in. And, if you know what was supposed to go in, it sounds a bit wacky. But sometimes they basically use tracked music is just take the previous or the next cue and just repeat it. And seems that they, didn't really want to bother with it because they just took some action material or some suspense material and they just, extend it until the scene finishes. And in that case, you have these, the longer sequences when they go on the river and they battle some primordial monsters or something like that. And that's the biggest tracking job. It consists of dozens of cues cut together, spliced together. And that's where I gave up basically. But otherwise they, they knew how to cleverly extend sequences. And, you can watch the movie with that in mind, that when you have these extended sequences, imagine the poor music editor try. Of course, in King Kong's case, it's easy because there's 2.5 hours of music to choose from. But for something with a little less score, it's harder to do that.
It's a bit of an insult to the more musically inclined. I can't imagine that James Newton Howard was thrilled by that prospect.
Well, I'm not sure if he ever wanted to see King Kong after those 7 weeks.
I'm sure not.
Pop in the extended Blu-ray and then notice what they did to his music.
Yeah.
Well, it does, beg the question, do we even need original music or anything like that? Because as you can see, we could easily track the movie. We can just do next time 1 hour of music, let's say 20 minutes of action and just cut it to picture and we'd be back to the silent days of cinema.
It's interesting. I think there's a little bit of a danger in that and, saying, do we need original scores? And I'm trying to think if more and more directors these days are trying to do movies without having scores, maybe just taking source music or maybe just taking library music. I remember when I was dumped from a short film, the director said, "Oh yeah, I just decided to go with royalty-free music." And I understood where he was coming from, but at the same time, this was for a short film. I'm just wondering what this is going to say for if that has sort of the same effect on studio features, or if that's never going to happen to go with royalty-free music.
Well, in the 90s, there was this real boom of soundtracks which had scores, but they were also very heavy on pop music. Like, for instance, the Joel Schumacher Batman movies, for instance, which had monster hits and monstrously selling soundtrack albums to go with it. Or you had all these teen comedies which were basically jukeboxes, or the Tarantino movies. Now, if you think about it, Tarantino has sort of matured, and from the cool kid who was spinning all his cool records, he went to actually working with the living film composer Ennio Morricone on The Hateful Eight. So he himself did make this transition, and I'm sure for the next film, which is going to be about the Manson murders, he's going to go back to the bit of doing 60s jukebox kind of soundtracks. But the thing is, if you want to use famous soundtracks and well-known songs, it's going to be very expensive. So more expensive than having original score.
There was a series that a couple of months ago did exactly that, where it took Bernard Herrmann and Jerry Goldsmith and John Carpenter, and I'm blanking on the name of the series.
Yes, I'm not big on television. I think it was the one with Julia Roberts.
That's it.
It's the one with Homecoming.
Homecoming, that's it.
And there it's like an artistic decision to go with that. And, it's not something I support, but I'm not a showrunner. So, at least I say the good thing is that people will kind of be exposed to awesome music from the 70s. So at least we have that. Queen doesn't need more exposure, but, Michael Small does. So, go with it.
That's true.
And, actually now when you think about it, there is one little revival when you feel your movie is in problem, add pop music, because then the people will say, I like the soundtrack, and by that I mean they like the songs. And Suicide Squad was the first one to do that they actually, after the first trailer hit and people commented positively about its use of Bohemian Rhapsody, they stuffed the whole film with pop songs, and they had a trailer company re-edit the film to have this very flashy, very quick cutting, very weird visual style. And of course, this new Bohemian Rhapsody film will also bring more exposure to Queen music. So I'm sure people will pay arm and leg to have Queen songs in their films. So there's that.
Especially now after Rami Malek won the Oscar, and Bohemian Rhapsody just swept the technical categories this year. So,
but if I can go back to rejected scores a bit, actually there's this very haunting story. Let's link to John Ottman, who just won his Oscar for Bohemian Rhapsody. When he did Cruel Intentions, I'm not sure if you remember this film, the one we brought together Ryan Phillippe and Reese Witherspoon and Sarah Michelle Gellar.
Right. Based on Dangerous Liaisons.
It's a remake of that for the Yuppie crowd. And basically what happened was that the film was screen tested. And originally they put in all kinds of, like, in the temp track while they were screening it, they had John Ottman's score in it, like in demo form or early recordings. And they put in some Beatles and, big stuff, like really expensive stuff, because you can do that with a temp track. And as they started finalizing the movie, they of course had to remove all the expensive songs, and it famously uses the verse Bittersweet Symphony in the end. But it actually gave a boost to that song, but otherwise they had to remove the big stuff. And actually the people who saw the latter version of the film gave lower scores to the music, and somebody at the producers or the studio felt that they were commenting on the score, that the score is not doing well, because of course you cannot change the songs. The songs are legally bindingly have been licensed for the film. So they did a quick replacement for Edward Shearmur, which I assume would be something like make a score that the kids will like. I'm not sure what the briefing was, but John Oateman was also a victim of the test audience in that case.
How many composers would you say are victims of test audiences?
Well, from the book, there are a handful of them which have to do with test audiences. Chinatown was nixed after a test screening, but it had to do with Bronisław Kaper, who was one of the viewers. He was a famous Polish composer, and he was the first one to negatively comment on the original Philip Lambrou score and convinced Robert Evans to go in a different direction. Legend, the Jerry Goldsmith film, was another one where the test audience, which was described as a kind of bunk smoking San Diego teenagers, were let loose on this Ridley Course epic, and they were expecting some kind of psychedelic stuff with unicorns, man, and then they got this straightforward fairy tale with demons and stuff. So these are some films where the test audience was actually quoted as one of the reasons why the score was thrown out. But one thing you have to remember is that the test audience rarely gets the chance to hear the final score. They see the film still with the temp track. They see the film with demos, mock-ups. They see the film with pop songs put in for good measure. But they are not just unable to comment on the score because they are musically not qualified to do so. They never actually get to hear the music. Only the last few test screenings have the final music in it. So, until then, I'd say the test audience could be a reason, but I think it can only be applied if the studio is already unsure about the film and the music. And when they get negative comments, as I say, and I think Christopher Reng also says in the foreword of the book, the music is the last thing you can change.
Right.
You cannot rewrite the script. You cannot get new actors. You can only change the music, basically.
Yeah, I remember Gabriel Yared was a big victim of test screening, and then he posted the score on his website, and basically hasn't worked in Hollywood since, or has very infrequently worked in Hollywood since. So,
but there's also for his case, I'd say that besides this move, there was something. If you look at the book, he had rejected scores before Troy. He had Wings of the Dove rejected. He had Les Miserables and so on. And in those cases, actually, is what I would call the Oscar curse, which he said that is like after winning for The English Patient, he was asked for big pictures for the wrong reasons, because the studios didn't want him because he was himself. They wanted him because he had an Oscar. And for somebody as artistically inclined as him, it's like you are asked for the wrong kinds of pictures.
Interesting.
Yes. In your book, when you write, for example, the movie Heaven Help Us, and you've got underneath composer of multiple scores, James Horner.
It's 1983, I remember that. Yeah, Heaven Help Us, it's 1985. So it's a film with very little score, and basically he had to write it 3 times. And first, so basically the question was how ethnic can we go, because originally it was something like a very Irish sound to it, and then they had this idea that they want like classical music, like almost like adapted Mozart or something like that. And the third score, the final score, was effectively the first one, but with less Irishness to it. So it was basically after seeing that something doesn't work, go in the opposite direction, and when that doesn't work, then you go and just figure out the exact problem.
Right, so it was more a case of rejected score than a rejected composer. I see. Okay.
Yes. It doesn't happen very often that composers are given multiple shots. I mean, as composers, that you are always asked to tweak certain cues, so that's not a rejected score, of course.
Right.
The times when I put in a composer when he like this was one instance, and the other was Basil Polidoris's Breakdown, or I think Morricone's Professional also falls into this category, is that basically after completing a score, you are asked to do a completely different thing. Or in this case, completely different thing for the 3rd time. So, but I don't deal with stuff like Jerry Goldsmith and Alien, which people like, oh, it's a rejected. No, it's just a score with lots of editing, lots of bitching, but it's still Jerry Goldsmith.
Why was it necessary? I see sometimes that you've written composer for European version and then composer for American version. Why is that necessary if they're showing the same film? Aren't they showing the same film?
Well, it's the same film. It can be multiple reasons depending on what age you are talking about. In the 1950s, lots of British American co-productions were shown with different music in Britain and different music in America, and that was strictly for contractual obligations, nothing else. In the 1970s, when you have a few of these more auteur films, for instance, Zombie or Dawn of the Dead, as you might know it, is basically the differing musical visions of two giants, Dario Argento and George Romero. And then you have something like The Big Blue, when the whole movie is recut to an extent that the old music doesn't fit. And also because the ending changes and the original tragic ending becomes a happy ending, you have to change the music as well.
I see.
So that's part of its reasons. In these cases, it's usually the film is usually recut or is changed in a way that it necessitates a new score.
I see.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the individual stories, you will see how they, how they differ from each other. So it's not like I can say some one reason that European and American film music is so different that you can only have it with different music. It's not that.
Getting back to King Kong, James Newton Howard, he does a lot of orchestral and synthetic blends, and I was wondering, because I wasn't hearing a heck of a lot of synths while watching King Kong, and I was wondering why, if you knew why that was not the case for the most part. I don't know if there was a desire to depart from the Steiner original, or very little synths. It was mostly straightforward orchestral.
I mean, don't forget that this film is very period perfect, and it takes place in the 1930s. It's specifically not. It's almost like they set the film almost in the universe of the 1933 King Kong, because everything is the same. The film is reconceptualized that way, and this film begs a score that is kind of old-fashioned, but also the action parts are mostly this kind of percussive, which is, partially due to the short deadline. It has to be this kind of percussive, easy to produce orchestral score, which you can just say, we need 5 minutes of action while the dinosaurs are running rampant, do that. Mm-hmm. But the real heart of the story is, of course, that I think the score is much more successful for the romantic stuff.
Yes.
Not the Adrian Brody, Naomi Watts stuff, but the Naomi Watts and King Kong stuff.
Oh, I agree with you 100%.
So I think it's much more successful there, because I think that was the heart and soul of the score, and maybe that was where Howard Shore didn't deliver enough, or I'm not sure about. Yeah, but it's, of course, it cannot be electronic, it cannot be hybrid, because otherwise the score has this period perfect look to it. So it was obvious this is not going to be something like Grand Canyon, where he could combine so much electronics and so much orchestra. No, it had to be mostly orchestral. And if you could do it with electronics, almost anybody could do it in 7 weeks. But with orchestra, that's the hard part.
Right. I was wondering, because something like Road to Perdition takes place in the 1920s, and I remember Thomas Newman was blending synths in the orchestra, and maybe it just worked well for the universe of that movie, and maybe not as much or maybe I'm just going off on a
But also
tangent.
it's a different kind of synth, so it's not like John Carpenter stuff, so it's more like textural stuff, so it to create an atmosphere. And King Kong doesn't need that really much. It has atmosphere in the visuals. If you listen to when they arrive to Skull Island, or when they have this newly added sequence of Jack Black contemplating life and death, that's where you have a bit of synth textures in the James Newton Howard score to create this kind of fog-bound, creepy Skull Island visuals. But otherwise, it is either an action score for all the great animal fights, or it has to be a romantic story. And for me, the romantics, usually I'm not into the romantic side of the scores. I usually prefer the action stuff. But here it's clear that the romantic stuff was something that the director was really interested. And some people say maybe it's a bit too much, so it feels almost like a real love story between Naomi Watts and CGI Kong. But hey, that's what the filmmaker wants. That's what the composer delivers.
Mm-hmm. for me personally, that theme that's associated with Ann Darrow's character, that was probably the one major theme of the movie that I could probably comfortably place alongside Steiner's original three-note descending motif.
Yes, but as you can see, what was important in the Steiner score, it was Kong. It was the music that was there to animate all those creatures. If you look at the spotting of that film, most of the music when the monsters are on screen, and the music is almost there to animate them. And in Kong's case, the CGI, with a few exceptions, even holds up still very well. As I rewatched the film for this, I just saw this one really fake-looking sequence when they are hanging on a rope and Kong is pulling them up. That doesn't look good today. But otherwise, the animals, the creatures themselves all look fantastic. So they don't need much musical help in that.
Right.
And the romance needs, because you have to believe that this human woman would prefer King Kong over Liev Schreiber.
That's true. For me,
she gets it.
Maybe that just went right over my head. But
Liev Schreiber's as Naomi Watts' partner or husband now?
I think they are divorced now, but he was his husband.
Yeah.
Goes to show how little I know about romance.
You just haven't met the right gorilla yet.
I have not met the right gorilla. There you go, folks. It's brilliant. For me, the heart of the movie, though, is this amazing performance by Andy Serkis as Kong, and it just speaks to his versatility as a motion capture performer. And obviously, he was Gollum in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and he was Caesar in the most recent rebooted franchise of Planet of the Apes. But there's still something. Sometimes it feels more like Kong is a bigger risk for Peter Jackson and Andy Serkis than either one of those characters were for Serkis. And I was wondering if you felt the same, or if you feel that Gollum or Caesar sometimes upstages Kong, or if you think Kong is like the preeminent in this case.
With Lord of the Rings, of course, Gollum was the first of these big motion. Now motion capturing is almost like an everyday kind of thing, that if in every fantasy film you have somebody, usually played by Andy Serkis, doing some motion capture. But of course, there are other actors in the field, so we didn't forget them, we just don't know their names yet. But with Gollum, it was because he was a fantasy creature. It was, you could do anything. But Kong is a gorilla, and you have seen gorillas. So the gorilla has to, even though it's much bigger than an average gorilla, you still have some expectations or knowledge of what a gorilla should look like. With Caesar, it's also like he's a monkey, but he also has this kind of humanoid quality. So, you can be a bit more human-like with it. Kong is supposed to be one big monkey. And in that case, I think the motion capture actor's biggest challenge is he cannot do whatever he wants. He needs to, so he has a black blueprint to follow. Gorillas in the zoos or gorillas in the wild, there are expectations with the gorilla. And of course, I don't want to pretend I'm an expert at motion capture, but also that Kong is like, of course, a much heavier build than any human, basically. So with your movements, you have to land it some weight, which for Gollum, who is just like this really skinny fellow, very how should I put it, somebody who can move easily, and who can bend his joints, because he's this bony, scrawny little character. Kong has to have weight. And actually with the music, it doesn't have to lend weight to the character, it needs to fill it with heart. With the Steiner score, you had to believe that this puppet is real. With the Howard score, you had to feel that this CGI creature can feel, and that's a big difference, I think. And I just feel like we should actually, if we talk so much about the comparison, do you have any experience with the 76 Kong? Because that was the one I grew up with,
I don't have any experience with the 76. That was John Barry, correct?
Yeah, that's John Barry's score. And it's funny because when I grew up, Hungarian TV had the 76 Kong on it. I only saw the old Kong as an adult, like in my 20s, when it came out in Hungarian DVD. But the old Kong was actually played several times in Hungarian television. And I do feel that the score there is a bit closer in spirit to the Howard score. It was trying to give some emotion to the relationship, and it also has some, funky disco track to not to forget. We're in the 70s. But yeah, with John Barry, you get what you get. It was from it's one of his earliest of these big epic sweeping romance ones. So when he ditched the guitar and tried to be a sort of serious romantic composer, and for that, Kong is a very important film in his filmography as well.
Got it. That's another one to add to the list. The '76 Kong.
Yeah.
I think some things it does better is pacing. With the Jackson's film, both the theatrical and the especially extended version they are bloated. They have too many fights, but I think what's even worse is that it simply takes them too long to get to the island. I think Kong appears like more than 1 hour into the film. And, these characters are not as interesting to spend one Kongless hour with them. So I'm sure you are in love with the material and, you want these people to be fully developed characters by the time they reach Skull Island, but it's just not as in because we are all waiting for Kong. And, one thing that I think the Kong Skull Island film did well is that it gave us Kong in time. It was criticized for having too many characters and not building enough relationship between them, but I'd rather have that than this, I'd say.
One of the things I said before you came on, I said 3 hours is way too long for a King Kong movie, and I think the first hour is absurdly too long. It does take us too long to get to the island. It does take us too long to get to Kong himself. And even when we do get to the island, it does take us a little while to get off the island because they spend a lot of time away from Naomi Watts and Kong and on the other people who are nowhere near as interesting, and some of them very badly missed.
They are canon fodder, basically, and you have this in the extended version. You have this 7 or 10 minute long, depending on how I count, this reverse sequence, which was cut out from the theatrical stuff. And it's just, it's one more monster attack, but this time it's coming from the water. So it's like technical marvel, but it's like, I think, the 5th attack by the time those guys.
Exactly.
So we've seen 4 of them bring us back to Kong, so to speak. And I think I read this in relation to Kong on a website that there are 2 kinds of 3-hour movies, one that feels like 4 hour and one that feels like 5 hour. And Kong is definitely in the latter category. Yeah. So
that's true.
I think it's good for a night when you really want to feel overwhelmed by sensation and you absolutely have no other plans for that evening.
Don't know.
Not even to rewatch Lord of the Rings for the 50th time.
Oh, I never did that. The funny thing is I'm not that die-hard fan to do marathons of anything. I work with film. I have enough films to worry about. I don't have time to just watch them willy-nilly. Yeah. So with Kong, it's like, it's not a good date movie because by the time it ends, it's like, okay, date's over, let's go home or something. You cannot organize a dinner around it. So
I think it's a bad first date movie too.
Well,
because because the gorilla would upstage you. Or
I was gonna say.
Why can't you be like Kong?
Why do gorillas always upstage me? God.
Yeah, well, of course, because they are big and strong and super hairy. So, yeah, I mean, that's maybe the thing that it's almost constructed like a date movie. It has something for the girls, something for the boys, but in the end, you won't get much action after it. So
I'm sorry, actually, towards the end, I started feeling a little uneasy with this whole romance. I thought it was quite creepy.
So you felt it was too real,
It was horrible.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's certainly better than that awful thing she has with Adrian Brody, which some of the most meandering, awful dialogue.
But now that you mention it, I wonder, have you seen The Shape of Water?
Yes,
I
it
I
was
Like,
have
how
so
does that
weird.
compare to the King Kong thing? Like, is that romance, more believable or easier to take,
No,
or
it
what's
wasn't.
your?
well,
No, I mean,
it kind of fits in also with the theme of Beauty and the Beast, and if I
obviously, it's a Beauty and the Beast remake for the 1950s called Paranoia.
Ah,
right, but
I
if,
think it was even like declared that this is like a version of Beauty and the Beast. I'm not sure about that, but it's
interesting.
definitely.
but if I
Ah,
if I want Beauty and the Beast, I'm gonna watch either the Cocteau
Oh,
or the Disney animated film.
oh yeah.
So
After you said Cocteau, I was like, yeah, somebody's taking the snobbish. I'm going to prefer the French original La Belle et la Bête. Thank you very much.
uh,
Something like that.
Georges score is just out of this world. It's
Yeah.
fabulous.
that's
Mhm.
brilliant.
And just if I can mention Shape of the Water, I didn't watch it in cinemas, and I watched it at home, and I was like, why does this score sound French? I mean, I understand that this is Alexandre Desplat, but the score had a very French sound to it, and I'm like,
Yes.
are we in France? Or no, they obviously speak English. Are we in Canada? Or why does it feel French? And I still don't know the answer to that question. Why does it have this kind of accordion sound in it? So why does it sound French apart from the fact that the composer is French? Or what kind of briefing was there? So it's completely mislocated. I had to pause the movie and look at Wikipedia where the hell this movie takes place because I was so curious. Is this in Calais? Are these French characters who speak English? Or no, they must be from Canada because the bus, the station, they are in English text, and then well, it's near Washington, so I'm like, okay, then explain the French music. Maybe it's to reference Cocteau or the French origins of Beauty and the Beast. I have no better idea for that.
Maybe. It was a lovely
You know,
score, though. There's no
yeah,
doubt.
it won an Oscar,
Yeah.
so it's lovely. It's just I felt misplaced in it. Like,
Yes,
where
maybe.
the hell? Why is this French? Ethnicity in film music is always an interesting question about when you go to a foreign land, how ethnic can you become without being racist? How Irish can you get before, you get bombed by the IRA? Or, how Chinese can you become before you become Fu Manchu? So that's what I'm. And Black Panther, for instance, walked this very fine line between being kind of African but without being like condescending to the continent. So it was a brilliant tightrope act, I must say.
Yeah, but
So
we
It
know
was it was
he went
Mhm.
and learnt about their culture and their music. He spent time there.
Yes, but
So
research is not the same as you can do magnificent research. For instance, John Barry, when he did From Russia with Love, he went to Turkey and went to locals to listen to the local music and came up with this is crap. I can't use this. So he wrote his own Arabic kind of Balkan music, which people think is authentic, but it's not. It's all the Western concept of how a gypsy camp should sound like, or how a Turkish sarai might sound like. With Black Panther, it's like you have the samples of the percussion, but you have it remixed and done in a way that it feels fresh. At first, I felt that the music is weird. And the first time that they got to score music, and I felt like somebody listening to music from the other. No, this is the score of the film. I was first completely, what is this? And then I got used to it. But you need some real talent to pull that off. So to come up with something that you would think is African music, but also has the dramatic power to match the Hollywood needs.
mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, and that was an absolutely brilliant score in the way that he did blend that tribal percussion sound with the modern hip hop production
And
sound.
But in
And
the end, you will come up and people like, how did you like the black? Oh, it has great music. Kendrick Lamar is the best. And like, oh,
Oh no, that's just not fair.
I know. I mean, I honestly can't remember how the song fits in the film. Like, is it at the end credits or? I've seen it only once, so I'm not rewatching Marvel movies by the spades. I knew Kendrick Lamar was doing a soundtrack, and they did this whole album of music from and inspired by Black Panther, and as you can expect, it was mostly inspired by. So I would get this kind of, is it called Dangerous Kids in your country? What's the film called? The one with Michelle Pfeiffer, the one with the Coolio song, Dangerous Minds, with the Gangster's Paradise. So I thought that Black Panther, based on the promotion, would be something like Dangerous Minds, full of hip hop songs in dramatically important places, and it wasn't like that. So there was some hip hop songs somewhere in the film, but it wasn't a full album's worth of hip hop classics.
Right.
And or maybe I'm more focused on the score and I just don't notice the songs anymore and they are in my blind spot. But anyway, it was just such a fun thing to see something both authentic sounding but not going so much so into the deep that you feel like this is insulting.
Right.
Anything else about our big hairy friend?
Do we have any more questions about our hairy friends, Zev?
I think we've pretty much probably covered everything.
I think in 2019, no other people have talked about Peter Jackson's King Kong as much as we did now. So it's funny that you have these films which remain culturally relevant, like The Lord of the Rings, and some don't, like King Kong. So it's not like it's like Avatar. So it broke box office records, but you don't see people dedicating too much time to it nowadays. Well, until the sequels came out, at least.
So shall we give a shout out to our other scores on this poll?
Sure.
We should, because we have a film historian in our midst. We should definitely give a shout out. So go ahead.
I'm so thankful you called me a film historian. So actually, when I'm introduced, in Hungary they often say, it's a film estate, and I'm nothing like that because I know what I'm talking about. I know the history of the films. I'm not talking about my opinion. Well, mostly I'm talking about as much as facts as I can. So what do you have
the
the list?
We select 6 movies for the community to choose from. And the second one on the list, which got 20 plus votes, was Troy, which, as you know, of course, the score was written by James Horner, who replaced
I know that, yes. Actually, we came back to Troy quite often during this podcast. So what I should mention about Troy and test screenings is that the composer was convinced that his score was unfairly judged because the choir wasn't mixed in yet. And he felt that having this unfinished mix in the score was one of the reasons why the score got such low points in the test scorings. But I'm not sure if the criticism was that it's too old-fashioned. I'm not sure the choir would have helped that.
Yeah.
But officially the score has never been released. It was up in Jared's sites and there were promos, and I think more people on Gabriel Jared's score than the James Horner score at this point. But it's still a divisive topic because there are people who do prefer the James Horner score.
The next one we had with 16 plus votes was, we mentioned this one, 2001, A Space Odyssey, score by Alex North, rejected, replaced with classical music, and later recorded in the 90s by Jerry Goldsmith. And I remember a quote from Kubrick. He said, "Why hire composers when you have this great collection of classical music?"
Yes, I think he said that around the time when he was interviewed about Barry Lyndon, which was also...
Barry Lyndon is, oh my god, one of my all-time favorite movies.
Did you say like the Blue Danube through this or something, and then that's...
Yes, the Blue Danube is one of the big pieces featured in 2001.
Yeah.
Yes, and the other big one, apart from other pieces, is the Also sprach Zarathustra, the Strauss piece, which, Blue Danube was known before the film. But Zarathustra was put on the map by 2001: A Space Odyssey. So the funny thing is actually, once again, not funny, is that before Alex North, Kubrick experimented with a lot of classical music. I have some of these kind of tests, like how he put Chopin for the training sequence, and these. And I got the exact recordings that he himself used to match them up to see how it worked, or how he wanted to have Symphonia Antarctica for the big psychedelic journey at the end. But he did have another score written for it by Frank Cordell, which was adapted from Mendelssohn's A Midsummer Night's Dream. It was recorded, the recordings do exist, but no release has been made so far. So that's the next big brave challenge that labels could venture out to get, is the Frank Cordell adapted score for 2001: A Space Odyssey. Right. And of course, when you mentioned that the Goldsmith recording, a thing about that is that there was such a, fundamental confusion about the Alex Northscore, which now the original record, I must stress, the original recording is also available. So, do try to get that if you want the full experience. Another Jerry Goldsmith recording is that the last track of the Jerry Goldsmith recording which is labeled something like Entracte or something like that, is actually the main title from Northscore to Africa, a 1967 documentary program, because the sheet music was just there in the stack and they just grabbed it and they recorded this music, and only after realizing that this was for a completely different project.
I see. Wow.
Interesting. Interesting.
The next we had on our list as well, we mentioned, which was Torn Curtain.
Yeah, I love Torn Curtain. I think I'm the person who has seen Torn Curtain the most time in the universe by this point, because of all the restoration, Jeff putting back the Bernard Herrmann score. Just like the King Kong, it was also rejected mid-recording. So actually the musicians went to have lunch, and by the time they went back, they didn't have anything to work with. That's how we. And actually,
it was because Herrmann deliberately ignored Hitchcock's instructions.
Yeah, I remember reading that Hitchcock was told by the studio, so this is a case where the studios got involved.
It's
they
more
wanted
like a
something
studio.
more pop or jazz based because of to reflect the changing tastes of society, and Bernard Herrmann ignored him.
Yeah, well, the thing with Torn Curtain is that there was very little communication between the two. Usually, before the projects, they had bigger discussions. And in the case of Torn Curtain, Herrmann was already living in London. So they basically exchanged a few telegrams. So they didn't have that. There weren't instructions to speak of, just a few passive-aggressive telegrams, and Hitchcock telling Herrmann that, how dare you rip off the music of money, enjoy in the morning, and that's all. So that it was already a bit strained. Hitchcock had this idea that Herrmann, basically he blamed Marnie's failure partially on Herrmann, that he wanted a fresh, sex thriller score from him, and he gave him this old-fashioned monothematic thing. And, it is old-fashioned and it is monothematic, but Marnie has far bigger problems than that. And Hitchcock actually replaced most of his crew by Torn Curtain, different cinematographer, different editor, that sort of stuff. And Herrmann was the last god standing, and he also had to go. Lou Wasserman at Universal also had an axe to grind against Herrmann. They had some argument before, so it was basically a battle he couldn't win. And one of the things is that they wanted a love theme. And Torn Curtain, if you see the film, it cannot handle the love theme. Herrmann wrote only one piece of love music, which he often did, called the Valsa Lente. So he hid the love theme into source music. When they have this kind of dinner at a cafe before Paul Newman is sent away to East Berlin, they had Herrmann's romantic theme, but otherwise it had no romance. The Addison score, on the other hand, had this very chirpy, happy-go-lucky love theme, which is sometimes almost comedic in its appearance. It's just it doesn't fit the film at all. And the horrible thing is that they actually did a theme song to it. The theme song is so horrible that they didn't put it in the film, but you can find it under the title Green Years, and it's basically an 80-year-old studio executive's idea of what young people like to listen to. It's this very sexual 4-women, 4-man choir singing about green years, laughter and cheer, and it's almost like Mary Poppins-esque. And Julie Andrews also makes the comparisons more.
Yeah. The next one we had was Air Force One, scored by Jerry Goldsmith and Joel McNeely, who replaced Randy Newman.
Yeah, I think that's what you get when you ask Randy Toy Story Newman to score your action film. That you have this. Imagine if. Do you think Air Force One could be done today? Would you see yourself that the president of the United States becomes this action hero?
If that ever happened, I'll eat my hat.
Yeah.
And even then, there was this problem whether, how seriously should we take this movie? And Randy Newman didn't take it seriously at all. If seen the score, have you seen the score with the rejected score?
I had heard that he used some of his rejected music in Toy Story 3.
Well, if action dressy marches, it's nothing like that. The rejected score, if you look at the film with it, actually it was once again, I think the last 40 minutes were left unscored because that's when they pulled the plug. It was written, it was never recorded. And the thing about it is that he, for instance, has this very kind of Mickey Mousing action music. So whenever something happens on screen, when, for instance, the Russian soldiers appear for 2 seconds, you have this big hunt for the Red October Choir coming for 2 seconds and then disappear. And
Right.
that sort of music. And for instance, the president's theme is very much like Ode to Joy, because he's talking about peace, and you have this kind of Ode to Joy sounding music, which always reminds me of Die Hard instead. So you have these kind of jokes. And Jerry Goldsmith and Joel McNeely, who was brought in because of the impossible deadline, it was divided up between them so that Goldsmith had the themes and wrote about 2/3 of the skews, and McNeely did the rest in Goldsmith style. And basically, it takes the film seriously.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now, one surprise I want to bring you is, I don't think I mentioned this in the book. It's something a friend told me, which is he was working with Randy Newman had some show at the same time, and there was this rumor that Wolfgang Peterson was already dissatisfied with the score, and he did work together with Ennio Morricone with In the Line of Fire, the Clint Eastwood bodyguard movie. And I think it was for a few days at least, it was in the air that they thought that maybe they should bring in Ennio Morricone to help with the suspense material, so it would be like a joint Ennio Morricone-Randy Newman score, which, imagine it now. And
It
then
sounds so weird.
Yeah, and then they just, we need Jerry Goldsmith. So, and but I think it was done as well as you could do in that period of time. And he did take Air Force One as seriously as you can take that movie. But there we know what the music compared like.
And finally, we had The Horse Whisperer, which was scored by Thomas Newman, who replaced John Barry. I'm not sure why, but Thomas Newman has not been a very popular choice amongst the community, and I'm one of his biggest fans.
I'm not. I can side with the community, but Horse Whisperer is, once again, there's not that much of a story. They like to say that John Barry reused the material in a concept album, but that's basically, to me, from the late John Barry period, a lot of the stuff sounds the same. So as much as of the Horse Whisperer he could take it. One thing that was very clear about John Barry at that period is that he was unwilling to change anything about his music. And as far as I could reconstruct the events in the Horse Whisperer, they had a misunderstanding about one cue. They wanted him to rewrite one cue, and he wasn't willing to do that. He said it's perfect, and then they just changed the whole music. And something similar happened with Mercury Rising, which was an action film, and John Barry by that point didn't really do action music, and his action music was considered lackluster. So in that case, Barry was kept on the film, his music was used, but the action music is actually by Carter Burwell.
Right.
And interestingly enough, Carter would be replaced on The Bourne Identity because he did a full big orchestral score for it, and then
Read my book. Carter Burwell was one of the composers who I actually talked to, and we talked a lot about of course, he talked about the Bourne Identity in great detail, which he wasn't shared anywhere else. And actually, it was, once again, he was working on the score, and before the recording or anything like that, they had a meeting and everything, and he arrived home on 2001 September the 10th. And the next day, we all know what happened. And then the Bourne Identity was rescheduled because, of course, it was one of the films which was kind of affected by this whole terrorist plot. And how do we solve this? How do we remove the World Trade Center and that sort of problems? So simply when they rescheduled the film, basically Carter Burwell wasn't available anymore. And he did write some kind of what he described like symphonic demos. So it was a very detailed sketches and ideas, but he never recorded an actual full-length score to it because of the rescheduling thing. It's all written down in the book.
Okay.
One of the things is that I always fight is when I hear this kind of, especially with rejected scores, you have a lot of urban legends or rumors, or these sort of things, and I always have to fight them when they pop up because I don't want them to spread anymore. It's it's the same as hearing the Moonrakers Master Tape 6 don't exist. No, I just have to fight these urges to get them rid of the consciousness. I'm not sure I can do that, but I'll give it my best shot.
Yeah.
That was the last one. So maybe I should just shut my mouth and read.
Well, it could help because, especially with, collecting material for this book was very hard because, I think John Ottman said that, I think it's quoted here somewhere as a motto. Yes, a book could be written about all the insane things that go on in terms of score politics, but it would have to be written by someone who doesn't need the work anymore. Now, that's me. Because I never had the works. I'm not a composer. I'm just a historian. And you can read some of the, for a lot of composers, especially the ones who had already passed away, I had to rely on alternative sources like studio memos and paperwork and paper trail or previous interviews. But from the currently living composers, I tried to interview as much as I could. And, there you can find Christopher Young, Marco Beltrami, Carter Burwell, Peter Bernstein. You can find all these names. John Scott was very helpful too. Joseph Loduca, Philip Lambro, he was still alive, God bless his heart. So we had all these people you can read in the acknowledgements. Those were the people who personally answered questions. So, and I think there are some interviews which were like really last minute things. So, for instance, there were a lot of old composers who I think I was the last people to talk to about their work before they passed away. So there's a lot of valuable material, I think, here.
Fantastic. Well, you've given us a lot to think about.
Indeed.
We're going to wrap up this fantastic episode. We are so very, very grateful for your time.
Absolutely. I'm happy to talk about film music. Always nice to find an audience who's actually interested in what I have to say. Very nice feeling.
Thank you so much, and we look forward to speaking with you soon.
Okay.
This was amazing, Gergely. Thank you so much
I thank you
for being
guys
a part of this.